places from. It's amazing how the brain remembers things, like you locate people in different places. Okay, what I want to do today and in the next several weeks, and I've never done it before, but I'm going to do it. I'm not sure how long this class will be. Probably 4 or 5 weeks. I just want to have, all of us, to have a really good understanding of the last 150 years. So I was rushing through the first 2,000 years or 3,000, which is fine. It's just the foundations. But the main goal of choosing to teach what I'm teaching was to get to modern Zionism and to establishment of the modern state of Israel. Okay, so I needed to rush through 3,000 years very quickly. But to understand what's happening today, January 7th, 2025, we have to really understand what was happening around 1880 and on. Okay? So I'm going to take the time, and if you have questions or comments as we go through the timeline, please don't hesitate. So what we are going to do today is to explore the beginning of modern Zionism. The word modern is really important in this context. Why is that? Why I emphasize modern Zionism? Because Zionism has been around for almost 2,000 years, still since the Jews were exiled from Judah or Judea or Palestina, their desire to go back to their ancestral land, to Israel, never ceased. They always wanted to go back. Every day, a traditional Jew prays at least 3 times about the desire to go back to Zion. Okay, so no matter where you were in the world, you were praying for one day to go back to Israel. Okay, so this is Zionism, basically, this idea that we want to, and hopefully, at one point with God's help, we will accomplish.
Understood. Yep.
Okay.
Somehow, we lost our land, we were exiled, but it's only temporary. And when you think
again, what do I have to do here again?
Global history of the world and God's power, 2,000 years.
I thought it was just like a peel and stick.
One day we will come back. Okay, so this is Zionism, the desire, the will to go back to Israel. Modern Zionism is a movement. It started around 1880.
Yep.
Okay,
so we're talking about less than 150 years
All right,
ago.
very good.
And this is going to be the focus of
Thank you,
our
sweetie.
classes today
Love you.
and
Love you.
in the next several weeks.
Thanks.
What was the main reasons or causes of modern Zionism? So when I ask a question like that, without knowing anything, you can always say anti-Semitism. Right? No matter where Jews lived, wherever they lived, whenever they lived, there were always people who hated them that caused them to want to get out of wherever they lived. Okay, and 1880, 81 were very bad years for the Jews. Remember, where were most of the Jews at that point? In Russia, as it was called, Russia. In 1881, and it got worse after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, the pogroms in Russia. When I'm talking about the word pogrom, we're talking about attacks on the Jews, killing Jews, maiming Jews, raping Jews. Okay, that was the main vehicle with which anti-Semites attacked and terrorized Jews. The pogroms refer mostly to Russia. Okay, so 1881 was a wave of pogroms, And, you know, you all saw a million times Fiddler on the Roof, movie, shows, right? And that was a pogrom, right? When they were friendly with the neighbors for a short time, but then the friendliness stopped. This is the period when more than 2 million Jews came to America. Most of your ancestors came around that time, after 1881. Okay, that was the huge migration of Jews to America, mainly because of these pogroms, because Jews realized it's not, we cannot do it. It's not sustainable. No matter how many good years we have, ultimately they hate us. And whenever they can or they want, and whenever there are issues, economic, political issues in Russia, there is only one major scapegoat, the Jews. So we have to do something about it. The one major thing was immigration to the United States, in which the doors were still open to the Jews of Russia, of Eastern Europe. The other thing was the Zionist movement. I'll talk, of course, much more about it. So anti-Semitism is a major cause. A second one is Zionism is a nationalistic movement. What do I mean by that? It's that a group of people decides that they deserve a state. They deserve to live in one place in their ancestral land and be independent. The Jews did not start it. Around that time, it was quite common. Ireland wanted at that time to gain its independence from England. India, okay, they started the Congress of Freedom of India in 1885, around the time that the Jews had their Congress. That was the time of unifications of Italy, of Germany. Okay, so all these national feelings were very much in the air. But there was one major difference between the Jews and everyone else. Very obvious one. So, yeah, the Jews did not live in their ancestral land. Everyone, yeah, the Irish lived in Ireland. They just wanted independence. The Indians live in India. They just didn't want the British to control them. But the Jews lived all over the world. Okay, at that point, about 6% of the residents of Palestine were Jewish. Okay, so it's not that the people of Palestine no, the Jews all over the world said, we want to go back to our land. That's a huge difference from all other movement that existed at that time. Okay, so that's why Zionism is not like any other movement that existed around that time. Okay, so this idea of nationalistic feeling was in the air. People wanted independence. The empires declined, right? British Empire, French Empire, etc. And people wanted their independence. So this is another reason for Zionism. That was the Jewish manifestation of their nationalistic feelings. We deserve our country like everyone else. And we have on our country. We had it for thousands of years. We just need to go back. Okay, so that was another thing to remember. We're not unique in this realm of wanting our state, wanting our independence, only that the majority of us did not live there. We needed to immigrate to our land, which is quite interesting when you think about it this way. Any comments? Another, oh, yes. Of course. Not just easier. How did the Jews call the US in 1881? A golden Medina, the gold state. There were the stories, you know, the roads are paved with gold. You know, of course, when you go to the Lower East Side and you learn the stories, there was not so much gold there and they didn't have so much fun in their tenements and living several families in one bedroom. But that was the image. Palestine had nothing, had mosquitoes. No, really, it was really difficult to be there because the first group of people who went, the majority of them left after a while because the physical conditions were really harsh. And another thing that we'll go back to all the time, Palestine was not empty of people. There were Arabs who lived there, okay? And in the beginning, they didn't have many problems with the Arabs. But still, there were other people there. So Palestine was not even a third world country. These terms did not exist. But it was really no place that Europeans wanted to go to. But America was an upgrade. Most people, when they immigrate, they want to immigrate to a better place, not to a worse place. Okay? That's one of the reasons that, the idea in 1948, now we have a Jewish state. So some of the people thought that now all the Jews will come to Israel, right? We have many Jews came, the survivors of the Holocaust, people who lived in Arab countries who got kicked out. But Americans didn't immigrate to Israel because American Jews had much better life in America than they would in Israel. Okay, so immigration always go from a bad place to a much better place. And America was a much better place despite the conditions that they had to endure. Still much better than life in Russia at the time. They didn't endure pogroms. Really, the worst event of violent event against the Jews happened only 3 years ago. That was the Tree of Life, right? In the synagogue in Pittsburgh. And that was something, a daily occurrence almost in Tsarist Russia. So we had violence and pogroms in Eastern Europe. We have the nationalistic environment. Yes?
The Jews, there were a lot of Jews in the Ukraine area, Russia. Did they go there right after 1492, or was it like a slow progression that they were?
A slow progression. Most of the Jews from after 1492 went to Italy, to Greece, to Holland, a lot of them. But it took time. Because first of all, many of them lived in Poland, and back then the borders kept shifting all the time. They were expelled not only from Spain and Portugal, also from England. I mentioned it, if you remember last time, and France, and some of the areas in Italy. Jews were not really welcome in Western Europe. Okay, it was not easy to be a Jew. It's not that everyone was just waiting for the Jews. And it was a natural place. And then, as we said, we talked about the limited place that the Russians gave to the Jews, the Pale of Settlement, etc. But that's where the majority of the Jews were. There was another reason that I mentioned in a different context, and this is the Haskalah movement, the Enlightenment. In the end of the 1700s, with the French Revolution, the emancipation of the Jews, Jews were allowed for the first time to go to universities and gain secular knowledge. Maybe I should say the first time after the golden age of the Middle Ages. But if you were a Jew, you couldn't just go to university for the most part and study whatever that you wanted. You were not allowed. In the late 1700s, they opened it up for Jews. So Jews went to universities and gained secular knowledge. They studied philosophy, they studied history, they studied linguistics, and that's when the assimilation started, because just, oh, wow, we don't want to be different, we want to look like everyone else. But in the context that I'm talking about right now, they started to see, wow, every country, everything we learn had a very deep culture. We want to study our own culture, our own literature and text and language using the modern secular methods. So that was a revival of Jewish culture. That was the revival of another miracle of the Jewish language, of modern Hebrew. Since Jews were exiled after the Bar Kokhba revolt, okay, I know all the holidays, you forgot tons of stuff. Okay, 132 CE, since then, the majority of the Jews lived outside of Israel. They did not use Hebrew as a spoken language. They used Hebrew for praying. They used Hebrew for studying, for the text, as we still do, but they spoke different languages. In the beginning, it was Aramaic and Greek, and then others like Yiddish and Ladino, but not Hebrew. Hebrew was not a language that people could use for everyday life. Until around that time that I'm talking about, the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, the rediscovery of Jewish culture, they started to say, whoa, we have our own language. Let's make it a real language that we can use for everyday life. And there was one particular man who is identified with that. His name was Eliezer ben Yehuda, who really developed a language. There were two kinds of Hebrew back then. Biblical Hebrew, literally, the Bible, the Hebrew of the Bible. Mishnaic Hebrew, the Hebrew of the Mishnah, because most of the Talmud that came after the Mishnah was already written in Aramaic. He went there and started to invent words. He was the one who came up with Hebrew grammar and came up with words and grammar to fit the needs of the time in which he lived, of the around 1880. And in almost no time, people started to speak Hebrew. We take it for granted. I mean, especially me, and that was the only language I knew for most of my life. But you know, my grandparents didn't know Hebrew. They came to Israel and had to learn Hebrew, and Hebrew has all the words that you need. Okay, so this is another miracle. So the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, the secular education affected the Jews tremendously. And they wanted to apply all this new knowledge, all these new methods to their religion, to their culture, to Judaism. Part of our culture and religion and history is the land of Israel. So there was a renewed interest, okay, not only in the Jewish text and culture and language, but also in the land. All of a sudden, whoa, we have a land too. And they started to dream. Okay, so the main reason for modern Zionism is really the anti-Semitism, the pogroms, the realization of the Jews that it's really not working. They can say in France and Germany and other places that we're equal citizens, but they don't really see us as such. There is anti-Semitism. It did not disappear despite the Enlightenment and all the wonderful idea of the French Revolution. And we need a solution to protect ourselves, to be safe. There's only one solution. The most important event, if you look at your timeline, is the Dreyfus Affair. Alfred Dreyfus was a captain in the French army who happened to be Jewish because he lived about 100 years after the French Revolution, where the Jews were equal citizens of France, and so he was a captain in the army. However, he was accused, falsely accused, and that's not my opinion, it would be proven later, to be a traitor, of selling state secrets to Germany. That was the enemy. Germany often was the enemy of France, but we're talking about now 1894. And there was a trial that was based on almost no evidence and a lot of fake news. And Dreyfus was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison on one of the islands. He lost, of course, his military rank, and there was a ceremony of public humiliation. Now, many French people knew that it was all false. A lot of the French intelligentsia, the poets, the writers, some of the politicians knew it was not true. It was almost clear that Dreyfus was framed only because he was Jewish. And it took about a decade until he was exonerated and restored to his position. We have to give credit to some of the French people who were actively fighting for Dreyfus. So it's not when we say, many people hated the Jews, but almost in every event, when you go deep into it, there were people who helped the Jews. They loved the Jews or they just wanted justice. Even when we studied the Holocaust, there were many people who risked their lives to save the Jews, okay? So we focus on the negative for a good reason, because we suffered a lot, but I want you always to remember, and especially during the Dreyfus affair, it really split France, because half of the people in France supported Dreyfus and said that was not the case. He's innocent. He was framed only because he was Jewish. Why is it so important? This is just another incident, but there was a man who lived in Austria by the name of Theodor Herzl. He was a journalist. Theodor Herzl was a Jewish man, very much assimilated, who at the time believed that the future of the Jews should be assimilating in the large culture. Because now he lived in Austria, he was a citizen of the state, he spoke German better than anyone else, and that will be the fate of the Jews. So he was sent by his Austrian newspaper to report on the Dreyfus affair. That was a big deal in Europe, also in the US, by the way. It was quite a big deal, this Dreyfus affair. And Herzl realized, and I mentioned this last time, but that was the key moment for him, when Dreyfus was convicted falsely, people were shouting on the streets, "Death to the Jews." Not death to Dreyfus. That we can understand. The traitor with the whole thing. Death to the Jews. At that moment, he realized we are lying to ourselves if we think that we're equal citizens. People hate us. People don't really accept us as full citizens of the European countries in which we live. The only exception, by the way, is the United States in the entire Jewish history. But we'll talk about it later on. I know that there are some incidents and things, but for the most part, yeah, Jews have never been so much accepted as they were in the US, had so much freedom and so much influence. But that's for a completely different lecture of the Jews of America, which is really a fascinating thing. Okay, just 1 second, I will come back to you. Okay, so Herzl, after witnessing the Dreyfus affair, had this realization that assimilation is impossible. We can have some good years, some good decades, but ultimately, Jews will not succeed of becoming complete part of any other nation, and the only solution is to have their own country. And what is this country? Palestine. I'm using Palestine because that was the country in 1880. Okay, so if you want to know one name of the father of modern Zionism is Theodor Herzl. Okay, this Viennese journalist, playwright, author. He was a fascinating man who died at 41, unfortunately, and was not even close to see what happened from his dream. And what he did, so if you see, he published his small book, Der Jewsenstaat, the Jewish state, and he said in this book that he dreamed a state for the Jewish people. And a short time later, 1897, an important day to remember, he established the first Zionist Congress in Basel. He gathers Jewish leaders from all over the world. Basel, Switzerland, because it was neutral, a neutral place. And he said, in Basel, I established the Jewish state. And he continues, he said, today people will make fun of me, but perhaps in 5 years, perhaps in 50 years, they will see that this dream became a reality. And he was right. Okay, so everywhere you go, every important place, official place you go in Israel, you don't only see the picture of the prime minister or the president, but you see the picture of Theodor Herzl. He's the man. He was a secular man, which is important. Okay, so this was the first time that the Jews of the world got together to discuss the Jewish problem. That's how they called it, because, anti-Semitism, we need to do something, they said. And that was the first Zionist Congress. Before I continue, Jan, did you? You mean the US? Yes. I can just tell you, if we will continue, I really hope to do it. It was much better to be a Jew in New York than Catholic in New York. Okay, there is a famous thing that Stuyvesant, the famous mayor of New York, when the first group of Jews arrived, they arrived from Brazil, by the way, and he didn't want them there. But one of the main reasons he didn't want to allow them to settle in New York, he said, if I'll allow these people to come to New York, then the papals, that's how he called the Catholics, would like to come. And then the neighbor is gone. Okay, so yes, of course, America, there is hatred towards every new group. That's part of the culture, not only of America, everywhere in the world. But the Jews did not suffer so much in comparison to others. So yeah, the Jews are much more welcome than Catholics, for example. Okay, so, but that's America. But there was no violence, or there was no institutional violence against Jews in America, still not today. Even though you have violence against Jews, is by individuals or some radical groups. But when we look at Europe, when we look at the pogroms in Russia, it was sponsored by the state. We're not even talking about Germany, okay? Here, if anything, the state is helping and fighting anti-Semitism. Even our synagogue is getting some grants for security, okay? I mean, it's the state, there is no state-sponsored anti-Semitism in the US. It's not to say that there weren't anti-Semitic presidents and many others, and there are not millions of people in this country who hate the Jews for different reasons. But it's not the state. And for the most part, we feel quite safe. We do have a police guard, unfortunately. No, it's something that is very painful for me personally, because it costs us hundreds of thousands of dollars that we should have used in different ways. So this is the major success of the anti-Semites, forcing us to spend our resources on security, okay, rather than programs and a million other things that we could do. With this money, we could have taken all the teenagers, the entire youth group, every year to Israel and back, first class, okay? But that's a different sermon, not now. So this is the idea of Zionism, or political Zionism. But there were other kinds of Zionism. So political Zionism, I mean, we need to have an independent Jewish state in the land of Israel, okay? And we are going to do what it needs. We want to be politically, this stand to be politically recognized by the other nations of the world, etc. That was Herzl. But there were some others who said, we're not sure we really want political Zionism. we don't really need a Jewish state like all the other states. We do want Israel to be a Jewish state, but not so much for political purposes, but maybe for cultural purposes. Let Israel be the cultural center of the Jews. Like Achad Ha'am, the man who is associated with that, said, Israel should be the heart of the Jewish people. And all the other places in the diaspora should be the different limbs, the different organs of the body. So the heart is the cultural place, okay? And we'll continue to have different Jewish communities all around the world. Way before the Holocaust, of course, okay? There are so this is, for example, other ideas. Other groups who had a different way of looking at Zionism were the socialist group. Israel was founded as a socialist country. I know that many of you take it as socialism and communism as a bad word, but Israel was founded as a socialist country. What is the most socialist institution ever existed in the world? The kibbutz. Have you been to a kibbutz or heard of the kibbutz? A kibbutz is a large community or a community. Nobody owns anything. Everyone works. Everyone does all they can and take what they need. Okay, so no ownership of property. Everyone is sharing everything. Okay, that's the pure Marxist or communist idea. And there were dozens of kibbutzim in Israel. Now there are, but they have nothing to do with the original kibbutzim. Okay, so if you're a socialist, if you're a Marxist at that time, which was quite prevalent, you said, no, we don't want another state because we, the Jews, should be part of the working class and should help the working class in each country where we live. We don't want to leave our countries and go to Israel. We're working class. We want to build a working class. So that was another group that had some influence. But there was one major group that opposed Zionism and still exists, and that for religious reasons. I don't know if you heard of Neturei Karta. Sometimes you see a group of Hasidic Jews demonstrating, rallying against Israel. If you go to an AIPAC convention or something like that, often you'll see a group of Hasidic Jews standing with the anti-Israel demonstrators. There was a famous picture of some of the Neturei Karta people going to Iran to a conference of Holocaust deniers. It's not that they really denied the Holocaust because many of them died in the Holocaust, but they see the enemies of Israel as their allies. And why they hate the whole idea of Zionism and the modern state of Israel? Because they strongly believe that Jews should not do anything to go back to Israel, but they should wait for the Messiah. Okay? And every act that pushes Jews to go back, to establish a Jewish community in Israel, is a huge sin. You have to wait, because God was the one who exiled you from Israel, and only God is the one who will bring you back. And what you need to do is to sit and do nothing. You know, it looks, if you are a person of faith and you really believe that that is part of God's plan, and you believe that God has a plan for you, you want to follow that plan. And for a bunch of secular Jews, semi-assimilated Jews like Herzl, to come and say, I'm going to establish a Jewish state, you cannot do that. Just wait for God. Okay? Even in the Holocaust, again, as a side comment, many of the rabbis, the Hasidic rabbis, told their followers not to leave Germany. Yeah, not to leave Germany. Partly some of them didn't want to go to US, that was worse than it. But this strong belief that God will bring us back. Okay? When you read the Passover Haggadah, if you really read it, you can get the sense of it. You know, God is the one who will do it, not us. The other reason they didn't like the Zionist movement and the whole idea was that they were talking about establishing a secular Jewish state, not a religious Jewish state, not a state that will run by the Torah and the Jewish law, but a state that more or less will look like all other states with a secular law. Okay, so this debate still exists, by the way. But that some Orthodox, not all, but some Orthodox refused to be part of it. And even Rabbi Schneerson, the guru of Chabad, right, never visited Israel for that reason. He never stepped a foot in Israel because he was conflicted about it. He was not against Israel, but for him personally, they built him a house, a complete replica of his house in Brooklyn, but he refused to go. So I want you to understand, I don't want to criticize, I mean, I do criticize Neturei Karta for going to Iran and meeting with, back then, Ahmadinejad, but I understand it, at least from a theological point of view. You have to wait for God. That's the whole idea. We talk about the Messiah, and they have a view of the Messiah as the one who will bring us back. And after the Holocaust and during the Holocaust, some of them blamed Zionism as the cause of the Holocaust. You see, they said, you wanted to settle Jews in Israel, and that's what God did to you, to show you how wrong it was. Again, I wanted to keep an open mind. I know it's hard to hear, but in this class I'm saying everything as it is. And when we have to talk about us, we talk about that. Okay, it's really important to remember that we're anti-Zionist Jewish groups. Okay? Now, there are less now because, you know, all these years later, Israel is a fact. And many of them are proud of Israel in a way. But still, Deborah? So when you read some of the prophets, what they basically say, I simplify it, oversimplify it. The prophet said that the people of Israel were exiled from Israel because of their sins, but, there is a big but there. At one point, God will bring the Messiah, and this Messiah will be able to bring them back. How exactly? It's not really clear. If you read Maimonides, for example, Maimonides believed that the Messiah is just a leader, a human being, a leader with the wisdom and the ability to unite the Jews, to go back to Israel and to resettle Israel with the Jews. Other people believed in sort of a miracle. Okay, but that was the idea that still people in the regular prayer book, there are prayers for this messianic time. Let me continue a little bit with that. So we had the first Zionist Congress. That was quite fascinating thing. And I want to go to another event that if I had taught this class before October 7th, I wouldn't have necessarily mentioned it. But now I feel that I have to. The Kishinev pogrom. Again, there are many pogroms, but when you grow up in Israel, when you go to Israel, you know about the Kishinev pogrom. There are several reasons. One of them is the other page that you have here. It was another pogrom. Kishinev was in Moldova. Oh, Clara is not here, right? We have a good friend from Moldova. Is a city in Moldova that more than 20% of its citizens were Jews. And 1903, a pogrom against the Jews killed some 49 people, seriously injured a few hundred, raped many people. It was a bad, ruined Jewish property and houses. But what made it so important is what you have here. This is an excerpt from a poem by the most important poet of modern time. His name is Chaim Nachman Bialik. You probably know about Chaim Bialik. Okay, I think they are somehow related. And he was the most important poet of the last, let's say, 150 years of the Jewish people. And Bialik is one of the people who contributed a lot to the revival of the Hebrew language. He wrote tons of poems. It's interesting. Can you think of poets who influence now? Today we have influencer. People go on TikTok to. Back then, when a serious poet wrote something, it made a huge difference. So Bialik went to Kishinev in order to report on this pogrom. And I did not bring the whole thing because he wrote a very, very long poem. It's called In the City of Slaughter, Be'ir Hariga. It's a long poem that many of us had to memorize at the time when they made you memorize important poems. And he begins by describing the horrible things that happened to the Jews. He starts by describing how beautiful the scenery was, the sun was shining, the flowers were beautiful, the whole thing, and the slaughter was killing. Okay, that's more or less the first line. But what made his poem so important was that he did not just criticize the anti-Semitic Russians. He did not just criticize the whole culture of anti-Semitism and blaming the Jews for everything wrong in their culture, in their countries, in their societies, but he blamed the Jews for doing nothing, for agreeing to be the victim, for not defending themselves. Okay, and he really knows how to write. And I just have a few excerpts here for you to see how sharp his criticism was. Just look at it. Come, I'll take you to their hiding places, meaning the Jews who were, instead of fighting back, they were hiding, where they scurried into cracks and holes, hiding like mice in the shadows, in the corners of their cellars. There they'll gather, they'll fast together, because what Jews do when they have a problem at that time? What did they do? They were praying and fasting, asking God to help. So he's mocking in a way these religious Jews who pray to God instead of fighting back. They will fast together, wasting away from hunger and thirst. You will see how their souls were swallowed by the darkness, how they sold their honor for nothing, their humanity for a crust of bread. So look at you in the mirror, he says, and see the brains splattered on the walls and the feather down from torn pillows still floating. Both will cry out, we are one. Meaning we are one, or if you want a reference to Shema Israel, you say Shema Israel, the Lord is one, but, well, praying is not enough, he's saying to them. And a third one, go to the cemetery, stand by the fresh graves, their dirt still loose and damp. Stand there and lose your mind. Let your eyes pop from your head and your head burst in your chest, but keep your mouth shut. That was the motto of the Jews, keep your mouth shut. Let them beat you. Run away if you can. Don't complain. Don't make waves. Don't rock the boat. Okay, that's the reality of being a Jew. From time to time we suffer, and that's what you do. You keep your mouth shut. Weep silently into your sleeve. Make no sound, and then go back to the city and go about your business as usual. And it continues. But look at this tone, okay? What he's saying here, saying enough, enough. We cannot be the perpetual victim. It's time for us to be able to fight back. But how can you fight back? How can you fight back against the Tsarist Russia? You have to go to your ancestral land. There's only one place in the world where you can be safe, where you can have your own army, where you can defend yourself. But staying here in all these shtetls, in Russia, in Poland, in Ukraine, this is going to be your destiny forever. Now, the truth is the Jews did do something around that time and established some Jewish defense groups, but they were not very effective because the enemies were much stronger. Okay, but I brought it because this Kishinev is so important, mainly because of Bialik and other people who said the same things. And it was brought back on October 7th, because that was the moment of crisis in Israel a year and a change ago, because now we have our country. We have by far the strongest army in the Middle East and one of the strongest in the world. We did everything that Bialik wanted us to do. And when you listen and read the stories, the slaughterer came and killed us, and we didn't defend ourselves. For some reason, the army was not there. And Jews lived in Israel a new pogrom. And everyone uses the word pogrom, and many people, especially Israelis, think about these lines that you're reading as they read the descriptions and see the videos of the people of the kibbutzim that were attacked by Hamas on October 7th. So similar to the descriptions of Bialik. Okay? Especially the first day. That was the huge shock. Beyond the 1,000 and more 1,000 people and the hostages. How did it happen? We did everything right. And here we are again, victims of a pogrom. And most of them were defenseless. That's what's going to happen with that, I don't know. I'm sure that the Prime Minister will come out perfectly fine from it. He didn't know anything, it was not his fault. No, it's, but the Kishinev pogrom was a very important moment for the Zionist movement, okay? Still 45 years or so before the establishment of the State of Israel. I want to skip a few of the things, the next page here. Now, in the beginning, I'm going to repeat something I said before. There were mostly Arabs in Palestine. They did not mind immigration of some Jews to Palestine. They were actually happy because they were buyers for their land, value went up, Jews brought new technology, Jews brought more money, because Jews who immigrated to Israel were backed by some of the billionaires, like Rothschild. Back then, they didn't call them billionaires, but the really wealthy Jewish philanthropists like Montefiore, other people. So they brought with them money, technology, knowledge, and many of them, as real socialists, wanted to be farmers because there was an ideal that the most important, the most valued profession is to work the land. Especially since Jews in Europe, for the most part, were not allowed to own land. There is a reason that we became money lenders, because we couldn't be farmers. We couldn't own land. Okay, so we have to find some other trades to make a living. So to go and make a living as a farmer, to own your own land, to grow your food on your own land, that was the ideal. Okay, that was a big deal. And they won and they bought a lot of land. Some of the Arabs became very rich, the landowners, who had land that was almost a desert, like, and all of a sudden there's a buyer who is willing to pay handsomely for the land. And that was the beginning of the tension between Jews and Arabs, or between Jews and Muslims. Look at the time here of the first Palestinian anti-Zionist, 1908. Probably there is a person who is still alive who was born in 1908. I mentioned many times that Jews did much better under Muslim regimes than they did under Christian regimes throughout history. The Muslims saw the Jews as much closer to them. They saw them, all of us, as the children of Abraham. Okay? So of course there were some acts of anti-Semitism. For the most part, Jews did much better in Arab countries. Today it's hard to believe, but that's when things started to change. So the tension between Jews and Muslims, Jews and Arabs, there's nothing fundamental about it. It started when the Jews went to that land and said, we are going to establish a Jewish land here. And the people, the Arabs who were there for thousands of years, started to realize, ooh, that's not going to work out well for us. We don't like it. Okay, it's not that they said at that time, they didn't have this national element and desires to have a Palestinian state. That came later, but that's where they were. Okay, the whole idea even of ownership of land was not so clear. You can go back to the American history again and think about the Indians here and the whole thing of what the white people did to them when it came to land. But, okay, but when they realized that these Jews are not kidding, and they're coming, and they're going to be a majority one day, or might be a majority, that's really the source of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it's a new one in historical terms. They didn't want, in the beginning they wanted us there, until we were too many. Okay? Anyone who read the new book of Malcolm Gladwell, did you read it? Don't remember, there's something about the tipping point, but the new tipping point, the tipping point 2.0, something like that. So what he's arguing in the book is that the neighborhood changes when a third of the people change. So he talks about it a lot about the US. When you have a neighborhood with a third of black people, it becomes a black neighborhood. All the white people run out, okay? So he shows it in this case. And that's one of the criticism of the African-American community of the Jews. They said, yeah, you really helped us, you supported us politically and did all these wonderful things, but when we came to live near you, you all ran out. Okay, so his mathematical equation is when a third of the population changes, the entire area changes. And I'm sure that the Arabs in Israel were not aware of Malcolm Gladwell and his theory of the tipping point, but they probably sensed it. And at that, when it started, there were about 6% of the inhabitants of Israel Jews, and they realized when there will be third, if we follow Gladwell's theory, this is going to change everything for us. And I don't blame them for not wanting it. I can tell you, if I were a Palestinian back then, I would have hated the Jews. Don't come and take my land. Now, who made the money from the immigration of Jews to Palestine? The landlords, the landowners. But the vast majority of the people had nothing. So when a Jewish agency buys farmland, okay, the landowner gets tons of money. What happens to the people who work there? Okay, and it was sort of a feudal system. You work for the Lord and you have a little thing and then out. Okay? So you can see the beginning of this resentment and why the Arabs did not want the Jews to come and why they didn't want the Jewish state there. But we needed a state. Okay, but it's important to see that this conflict has really two sides. And we see here where things started. When it became real. When it started to become a reality that Jews may establish a Jewish state there. And the most important thing that I want us to look at, if you can read the last one, you can read it later, but read the last declaration of Balfour. That's the way I want to, you don't have to do it here, I just wanted to mention that this is super important to understand why we have a country. Okay? So at the end of the Great War, First World War, it's interesting, the Great War. At that time, why is it the Great War, you know? Nobody believed there will be another one. After what they experienced, they were so certain that there will never be anything like that again. Okay, so that was the Great War, until it wasn't, okay? But it's still named the Great War. It was clear that the Ottoman Empire, Turkey today, is going to lose. And the French and the British started to divide among themselves the spoil, the land that were controlled by the Ottomans. All right, so the famous Sykes-Picot Agreement from 1916 that you see it here divided more or less the Middle East to areas of influence. And for our purposes, Palestine was given to the British. Not only Palestine's, okay, but for our purposes, what was known as Palestine or Palestina was given to the British. And they had a mandate to control this area until somebody will decide what to do with it. Okay, so now the land is not controlled by the Ottomans, who controlled Palestine for 400 years. We have the British. And it was much easier for the Jews of Western Europe to talk to the British. And one of these very important Jews that doesn't get enough credit is Chaim Weizmann. Some of you heard of the Weizmann Institute, sometimes called the MIT of Israel. I don't know how MIT it is, but it's a very serious technological institute named after Chaim Weizmann. He was a very important chemist at the time and one of the leaders of the Zionist movement. He was able to go to England and convince the British to promise a Jewish a Jewish state on the land of Israel. And this is called the Balfour Declaration. Balfour was the British Secretary of State, okay, or the Foreign Minister, probably Foreign Minister. It's a better title for a British, for the British position. And he wrote this letter to Rothschild. Rothschild was probably one of the, if not the most famous Jew back then, because he was, I don't know if it was the wealthiest, but he was known as one of the wealthiest people in the world. And he wrote him a letter, and I have a little excerpt of it that you can see here. His Majesty, do you see the last paragraph on the other side? His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Can you imagine what it did to the Jews? Finally. And it's not that they didn't try to convince other people to support them, but finally they got this promise from the biggest empire of the time, 1917, okay? And will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights of political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The Jews were thrilled. Okay, we have the support of the British. They now are in control of Palestine, and if they want, they can give it to us. What Herzl started, 1897, okay, it's only 20 years since the first Zionist Congress. That's not a long time. We can do it. We have a promise from the Brits. We're getting it. Only that it didn't work out so well, because not that the Arabs of Palestine had any power, they had less than nothing, but the Arabs around the world had a lot of power. And they had oil. And they have other things. Okay, but that's for next week. So we celebrated the Balfour Declaration, which is still a very important, probably one of the most important documents in the history of Zionism and modern Israel. And it's really the beginning. Or not the beginning, but a huge step into this conflict, the Arab-Israeli, because now we are in even not necessarily physical war, but the conflict is very clear. With the Arabs who live in Palestine, the Jews who still live in Palestine, a small group at the time still, and all the Jews of the world who are talking about moving to Palestine, okay? And for the British to give us this land. So 1917 is, yeah, we did quite well, where we will end with the Balfour Declaration, and the aftermath of it we will cover next week, probably from 1917 to 1948, okay, until finally we will get our land. I can tell you we're not going to dwell a lot on the Holocaust, because that's a completely different subject, okay? And but we'll mention it when it's relevant. Any comments or questions? The map of the definition of Palestine has been changing forever, okay? It has been changing. What made Palestine, it's the Sykes-Picot, the agreement between the British and the French of how to divide that land. And what they did, and if you look at the map, maybe we should have a map next week, so we'll go back to it a little bit. They took a ruler and a pencil. And when you look at the border, okay, this is Transjordan. There was no Jordan yet, but Transjordan. This is Syria. This is Iraq. This is Egypt. This is Palestine, okay? This is Lebanon, which explains so much of the mess that we are experiencing, not only for the Jews in Israel, but all the places that I just mentioned are a mess, right? I mentioned Syria and Iraq, and Jordan is in a horrible shape, okay? And you definitely don't want to live in Egypt. And when you think about it, Egypt is probably the only country that always existed. Egypt. There was no Transjordan. There was no Iraq. There was Mesopotamia. That was a completely different entity. There was no Syria. Syria had completely different borders. Okay? Egypt has been around forever. Completely different place and different culture and different language and different religion. But still, we know Egypt. If you look at the ancient maps of Egypt and modern maps, more or less you get the same picture. But the rest, Is this really? Pencil and a ruler? Okay, this is, and we like King Faisal. Oh, you get Saudi Arabia. Yeah. And you get, no, really? That's how it happened. It's crazy how they divided it. And 100 years later, we pay the price. And we'll keep paying the price. Okay, but my goal is to show you the genesis, the origin of the mess in which we find ourselves in. Balfour Declaration, super important. Hopefully we'll get to 1948 next week. We'll have our country, and then we'll learn about the history of... Oh, okay, last comment or question.
Balfour was so esteemed that women are being named Balfoura.
What is...
Balfoura, that's the Hebrew name.
Balfouria. Yes. Yeah, there is Balfouria, and we love Lord Balfour. He was a really good friend of the Jewish people, and we owe him a lot. See you next week. I hope to see you on Saturday night. If you can make it Saturday night, please join us. It's going to be a fabulous event. 40th anniversary for this synagogue is not a small milestone.